should NDIS funds be able to be used on sexual services? That's a question being debated this week after NDIS Minister Bill Shorten said access to those services would be removed if draft legislation is passed in the Senate.
The disability sector warns the cut in funding will rob participants of free choice.
In the face of spiralling costs, can the NDIS afford to fund sex?
In today's deep dive, we're going to explain why the government is making changes to the NDIS, the arguments for removing access to those sexual services, and why some disability advocates are against the move. People with disability will no longer be able to use National Disability Insurance Scheme, so that's NDIS, funding to access what's called sexual services, and that is under a series of reforms to the system. It was confirmed this week by NDIS Minister Bill Shorten, who said on Sky News that sex work would be removed from the list of approved services if the proposed legislation to, quote, tidy up the scheme passes Parliament.
This is a topic that, when I've been reading online about it over the last couple of days, has really strong views on both sides. I want to go into what those views are, but before we do, tidy up the NDIS, there's a couple of terms being thrown around we need some clarity on. Give me some context on the actual NDIS itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So the NDIS, as I said, is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It provides support and services for Australians with disability. The way it works is that individuals are allocated a personal budget, and that's calculated on what is reasonable or necessary for each person. Funding includes access to things like community services, transport, vehicle modifications, and help with kind of day-to-day activities. It was launched in 2013 and it was completely rolled out only in 2020. There are now over 610,000 Australians who receive support from the NDIS.
And I get an interesting perspective on this story because I'm married to somebody who writes NDIS reports and I kind of see how much paperwork goes into the back end of these. So have sex work services been available then for people who get through the qualification process and do qualify for the NDIS?
So not the whole time. Specialised sex services have been available through the NDIS since 2020. And that was the result actually of a court case that was brought by a 40-year-old woman with multiple sclerosis who was denied funding for a trained sex worker. She then launched a legal challenge to that rejection, and she argued that the NDIS Act doesn't explicitly exclude sex services. Ultimately, the federal court ruled in her favour and it found that there was no implied exclusion of such activities. And in our opinion, the better view is that they are intended to be included. So that being a direct quote from that federal court decision.
Can you give me a sense of how prevalent this is in the NDIS? Is this rolled out to everybody?
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to focus on, because I think when we talk about stories like this on a national stage and people have very strong opinions, it kind of seems like it's widespread, it's everywhere. That's absolutely not the case. So I do want to give you a sense of the numbers, and that's just going off Bill Shorten, as I said, who's the NDIS minister, what he has said. But this week he told the ABC that there have been 228 requests for sexual activity support in the 12 months to the end of April, but that he, and I'm going to quote here, said none of them were granted.
Right. So in a pool of 610,000 people receiving NDIS funding, there were 228 requests and we don't think, according to the minister, that any of them were granted.
Correct.
So why is it a topic for us to talk about today?
So the reason that we're talking about it is because the government is trying to pass this legislation through the Senate, and that legislation is kind of a suite of reforms that's broadly aimed at cutting costs associated with the NDIS. The federal budget has predicted that NDIS costs will rise from $44.3 billion this year to more than $90 billion by the end of the decade. So that is a huge, huge spend when it comes to the government's budget. And so right now, the Albanese government is looking at those costs and trying to figure out ways to bring it down, to bring down those costs across the board. And that's why they've introduced this legislation that I said is currently in the Senate, and that's aiming to save $14.4 billion over the next 4 years. And the way that the government is looking at really bringing down those costs is by doing a number of things that includes streamlining the goods and services that people can access with NDIS funding.
And so if we zoom out a little bit and look at the broader context of where this discussion's taking place, I remember in the budget address by Jim Chalmers, there was discussions about waste in the program and an ageing population, and there's clearly those projections you've just taken us through, and they're kind of trying to tighten the belt here.
Exactly. And that's the context that this conversation has emerged. So Bill Shorten, as I said, confirmed this week that sex services don't pass the test, is what he said directly, and that they will be cut from this NDIS funding as part of these cost-saving measures. I'll quote him here. He said, "What we do want to do is make sure people have the ability to get things that are reasonable and necessary. The rules have been a bit loose at the margins."
Right.
I think for a number of reasons, that's been picked up across the board by the media, by other politicians, and has become a bit of a focus in politics this week. We heard from Barnaby Joyce, who is from the Coalition. He made his position pretty clear this week. He said, and we included this in a newsletter this week, he said, "You don't want to pay for someone to have a wild all night between the sheets on the taxpayers' ticket."
Right. So there's very clear perspectives from within the halls of Parliament House in Canberra as to why sexual services should be excluded from the NDIS in this effort to cut down how much this program costs. But that's only one side of the argument. The other side of the argument is why people think it's a necessary part of the program.
Yeah.
What are those arguments?
There are a couple. I'll start with what Women with Disabilities Australia has said. So they believe that the NDIS should support the sexual expression and autonomy of people with disability. They said, I'm quoting here, "People with disabilities should be able to access funded supports that enable us to realise our rights to sexual health information, sexual pleasure, expression, association, freedom, autonomy and self-determination." And I think the realising our rights part is really interesting. There were a lot of comments when we uploaded this story to Instagram about people talking about access to sex and access to safe sex as a right. So that's something that's been reflected here by this advocacy group. I think if we take a step back more generally, some of the arguments that are emerging is advocates pointing to examples of people with psychosocial disabilities who learn about safe and respectful relationships in these settings. And if you're removing that ability, what is left? Where can they be learning how to have safe sex, how to have respectful relationships, all of these things. So that's another argument. Another one, and I saw this again a lot in the comment section, is about what advocates believe is a double standard.
Okay.
So Viagra, which is an erectile dysfunction pill, is supported by the Australian Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme.
So that basically means that indirectly taxpayers are subsidising the cost of Viagra.
Yeah. So the PBS subsidises that drug. And the logic that follows for these advocates is that if taxpayers are subsidising that cost to help men have better sex, then why are people with disability treated any differently?
Interesting.
In the walls of Parliament, you said before that we have got this pretty clear image. The Greens depart from that view. So we heard from the Greens spokesperson, Jordan Steele-John, this week. He said that the reforms are deeply unpopular and damaging and that they fail to acknowledge the needs of people with disability. Said Minister Shorten is supposed to be supporting disabled people and their families, not cutting their services.
I think the other view that is worth mentioning is some of the content that I've read and watched little short videos of this week as well that represent the view of people who work in this space, specifically trained to facilitate good experiences with people with a disability, and their view of the fact that it takes sensitivity and it takes particular skills to ensure that those people have positive experiences. I think that's a perspective worth including as well. Definitely
worth including, and definitely a really interesting topic. I guess where the response to that lies is, should that be taxpayer funded or should that be privately funded by the individual themselves?
It's a really interesting topic, and I just keep having that number in my mind of the under 300 requests that you said had been filed in the last 12 months in this program of over 600,000 people.
Me too. And I had this kind of inner dialogue about whether we should do a podcast episode on this.
I wanted to ask you, why are we covering it?
And the place I got to, and I think some people might criticize this, and I think that that's fair. The place I got to is that a lot of people have seen headlines about this, and a lot of people are going to see headlines about this. And I think that taking the time to explain it is really important here so that people don't come to conclusions that aren't based on fact. But there is a lot to be said about the fact that, the NDIS does so much good. It is so important. There are lots of people who aren't getting what they need right now, and perhaps, focusing the media cycle and focusing, political attention on this is taking away from the attention that is needed for so many people across the board, and also at times could be distracting from that great work.
Okay, and just quickly, just so we all have clarity on it, this is still yet to pass.
Correct. So the bill is in front of the Senate at the moment. The Greens and Coalition voted to refer it and its amendments to a committee for review, but that's a fairly standard thing. That just means interrogating it a bit more. Mm-hmm. We did hear from Barnaby Joyce that despite voting to have that bill reviewed, the Coalition is likely to support it. If that does happen, then the legislation will become law. Anything can happen, who knows, but it does look fairly likely that it will pass the Senate.
Thanks for taking us through that, Zara. A very interesting topic about a kind of area of policy that has so many complexities, and I'm glad we could explore some of those perspectives. And thank you for joining us today on the Daily Aus. Really appreciate you supporting independent media in Australia, particularly youth media, in what's been a difficult couple of weeks for youth media across Australia. If you enjoy this podcast, I'd love if you could just throw it in the group chat. Open your WhatsApp, open your Slack if you're at work. Share this episode with people around you who you think trust your judgment to send them some good stuff. We'll be back again tomorrow. Until then, have a good day.